Thank you for having put this together. I think it's really challenged both Radhika and me to think about the things that we do sort of at a meta level, take a step back and see what is it that we do and what is it that we're trying to do. So like the title for today's session suggests, we're going to talk about performance, primarily dance and music, as ways to experiment with dealing with issues that are not necessarily within the purview of the performing arts, but can potentially be brought in to these circles for making some effective forms of communication, for raising awareness, and also as a form of research, I think. So before we start talking, since we're going to be looking at performance, let's look at a short clip. This is a project that Radhika undertook a while ago, and we'll talk about what it is and what it means. But first, let's watch.
Okay, so this was an experiment in which we tried to explore the idea of how we all know and think about is how life emerged from water and eventually returned back to water. So if you also look at the hand gestures, you'll see that first the hand gestures have been abstract and formless. Later they move into a bit more codified form, and then actual creation of an entity, which then goes back into water. So the idea was to explore and experiment with this concept.
And the entity that you finally create, do you want to talk a little bit about why that specific entity?
The entity that you see is a pot, an earthen pot, because this was also shot in a pottery studio with the mud that they use. And a pot over here also symbolizes human body. And we'll see the connection to that later towards the end when we speak about another project.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I think, this resonates with so many ideas across disciplines about things being born out of water and then finally culminating or dissolving in water again, right? I mean, even if we just look at the current theory of where life started, it probably started in an aqueous system. It probably started in some water pool, millions of years ago. And, more closer to what we do as humans, right? The culture that we cherish, our civilizations, which have led us to this point in history, would have just been impossible if we hadn't learned, I think, how to harness the power of, all natural resources, but water specifically, I think. And so it's sort of nice that we put water at this central position, even in performance, which is really, I think, culture at its, most evolved form. So Radhika, you've been thinking about using performance and particularly dance in bringing to the fore ideas about water. And from conversations with Radhika, I realized that much of this ability comes from her training, which is actually really, really unique. So I'd like for our audience in person and online to know how you've gotten to this point. How did you start thinking about these ideas?
I have been a student of dance since childhood, and I've also been fascinated with earth, water, nature, and therefore geography, and then therefore environmental studies. Um, Both these interests were actually streamlined during my bachelor's at Flame University, which was an integrated course where I got to do my majors in environmental studies and minor in dance. And I think those 4 years really wired my brain in a way where I could switch between two fields and two subjects very easily for 4 years. It was literally like 7 a.m. movement class, straight into atmospheric physics class, then into a dance theory class, and then back into urban governance class. So I think my brain just got wired that way. And later on, I did go on to pursue my master's in water science policy and management. Um, After which, since 2015, I have been working with different organizations such as Kalpavriksha, and then I also had an opportunity to work at an organic farm for a year. I worked with an organization called Gomukh, and now I'm based at the Center for Water Research, where I'm working on different projects related to water audit. I'm also working on a river island in Mulamutha River, and I'm also part of the AQUAMUSE project. And while I'm doing this, I'm grateful that I'm also able to continue my dance journey. I've been able to go deeper into the dance training and through Bharatanatyam as well as through yoga, a bit of Kalaripayattu and contemporary. So really trying to explore both the fields from different angles. And yeah, so that is what helps me think about these two subjects from different point of views, really. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I think that's sort of a kind of training that very few people have access to, at least in India. And I think that we need to be able to find ways to bring the performing arts and the arts in general more into the mainstream in our, in our academic journeys. So what are you working on at the moment?
So right now, along with the research projects that I'm working at the center, I am also exploring this idea called rights of rivers and rights of nature. And the idea of rights of rivers actually comes from a legal framework where environmental lawyers across the globe started thinking that there's some problem in the way our environmental laws are structured right now, and that they are very human centric or anthropocentric, and we are only talking about laws of how much we can extract, how much we can use from a river or from a forest. And maybe it's time that we shift that lens and make our legal jurisprudence a little bit more ecocentric and not anthropocentric. And that's where this rights of rivers and rights of nature framework is coming from. And as you can see, it also has a history since the very famous article written by Christopher Stone in 1972, where he spoke about why trees should have a standing in the court of law. And this article was used in a legal court case later. Subsequently, we have seen a lot of declarations and conferences. We have also seen constitutional amendments and court rulings where this idea of rights of nature and rivers is being propounded. However, while we are seeing all of this happening, there is also a lot of criticism around it, and I would like to go straight away into it because once you say rights of rivers and rights of nature, there is a mental block. So let's address it first. So in India, the rights of rivers became a popular discourse or a narrative in 2017 when the Uttarakhand High Court passed a ruling that Ganga and Yamuna and all the tributaries have a legal standing in the court of law, and they are living entities or they are legal persons in the court of law. And this case was inspired by the Wanganui River case from New Zealand, where the Maori tribal communities believe in the idea of I'm the river and the river is me. And inspired by this, we had the 2017 Uttarakhand court ruling. However, this court ruling was stalled in the Supreme Court because of various issues and critiques and limitations. First and foremost, being the issue of implementation. The fact being, Ganga, Yamuna rivers are interstate rivers, they're transboundary. So, how can one state pass such a law? Doesn't make sense, right? The other questions which were raised were if river has a right to flow and live, what happens when the river causes floods and destructions? How do you punish the river? Right? And then there were also critiques and limitations around the fact that the people who were supposed to represent the river in the court of law were actually government employees themselves, government agency. So again, raising the question of how can a government speak for and against itself in the court of law. And the other criticism was also that this is mere symbolism. This is really not going to do anything for the rivers, because the very fact that we are saying that the river should be looked at as legal person, we are still being very anthropocentric and human centric. We are looking at river as a human being again. So again, we are redoing the same mistake. And the other critique for it was that this is a very Western concept and we don't need it in India. And this started making me think about what are we really dealing with over here. Because interestingly, at the same time, while I was reading about this discourse and listening to people speak about it, in the dance frontier, I was learning a choreography in which I was taught to show Ganga being angry. And it made me think about how in dance, when I depict Ganga is angry, it's an idea where people are very receptible to. People generally even applaud to the performances. But the same idea that Ganga is angry is looked down upon in a legal context. So what is happening in these two frame of mind or perceptions, that in one case it's an idea to be celebrated and danced and enjoyed, but the other side it's something that is considered to be illogical and impractical. And that thought process led me to the research project called The Rights of Rivers Through the Lens of Bharatanatyam, which was supported by Parivartan Research Grant. So that is where I am right now, exploring the idea of rights of rivers and Bharatanatyam and seeing where it is all coming together or not.
So we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of how you're doing this, of course. But, just off the bat, why do you think we need to have rights for rivers? What advantage is it going to bring to, the way we deal with them in the future, let's say?
Right. And to answer that question, I would like to go to this quote. I was reading an article by this author, Gard, where she starts the article with these quotes. She says, throughout the industrialized world today, one of our most intimate contacts with water occurs over the toilet. Where did we get the idea that water was a place for waste? And how does that idea cohere with the fact that we need clean drinking water to survive? And I think these few sentences really made me think about how we are looking at our rivers and water bodies today. And there is a fundamental contradiction in how we are associating with our water bodies. And I think, therefore, something like rights of rivers, an effort like rights of rivers, is maybe nudging us or pushing us to go beyond this contradiction and to look at how we are relating and associating with our water bodies. And therefore, I think it's something that we need to think deeply about and go deeper into understanding of what it means. And this is also coming from the fact that we are seeing conservation activists and researchers speaking about how the very existence of empathy is considered to be the most core element if you need conservation strategies to succeed. And therefore, they're speaking about how the idea of care and affection and belongingness becomes very fundamental when we speak about conserving water bodies or rivers and even forest and other natural entities. And so to that extent, then coming to the idea of how then art forms are speaking about this idea of empathy, I came across this term of anthropomorphism, which you'll find across all art forms, across all cultures, where we have been for centuries and decades looking at rivers and entities as living beings or living entities. And this idea of anthropomorphism therefore becomes something very similar to the rights of rivers discourse, which speaks about looking at rivers as legal personhood or living entities. So I think that's where I start drawing the connection between a legal framework and an art form. So that's where I'm at.
So I think it's interesting you brought up the idea of empathy and how it probably connects with conservation efforts. I think we see this, for example, with conservation efforts towards specific species, which are just, which fascinate humans. So, for example, conservation efforts towards tigers tend to be far more successful than conservation efforts towards, let's say, an insect that's about to go extinct. And the only logical or the only connect that one can make between these two seemingly disparate observations is the fact that the tiger is just, we just connect with the image of a tiger so much more that we're much happier to rally the efforts, raise funds, etc. But if I say let's conserve the cockroach, it'll probably really, I mean, let's not conserve the cockroach, but if it's, but if it's an insect that we're talking about, it you require to put in the groundwork to create that sense of empathy, I think. But as a scientist, I must put my foot down here and say that anthropomorphism can be really problematic as well, right? And I think that we typically connect it with deep religiosity. We connect it with a lot of things that we don't consider rational in today's scientific discourse. So don't you think there's some sort of orthogonal paths that we're taking with anthropomorphizing rivers?
Yes, and I think I'll not answer this. I'll let Calvin and Hobbes answer this question. Yes, anthropomorphism has been critiqued and criticized for a very long time, because as you yourself mentioned, it also, the origins of this idea comes from theology and associating with gods and human-like gods, and therefore considered to be superstitious or based on blind faith. And we have also had writers and scholars speak about anthropomorphism as based on superstition and also womanish pity, which is then not based on sound reason, right? But at this point, I would like to bring in the field of psychology and neuroscience into the picture, where psychologists have been speaking about how the very fact of anthropomorphism, or the fact or ability to anthropomorphize, is a function of human brain, and it's a very important stage in human development, to the extent that neurologists have coined a term called aphantasia, which means a neurological disorder which relates to lack of imagination. So to say that the ability not to anthropomorphize, or the ability not to relate with something besides you as a living entity, could in fact be considered as lack of a social cognitive process. So therefore, to say that it's very much part of human functioning. And I think a very beautiful example is the movie of Castaway by Tom Hanks, where we see that he started associating with an entity outside of himself in order to make sense of what is happening around him, and in order for his survival. And therefore, to say that it's a very basic, fundamental human cognitive process. So yeah, so I don't know if that answers.
So you think
your
that there's
question.
value in associating at least human-like
Yes.
qualities?
And we see, right, we have people who have pets who do not like when other people address their dogs as dogs. Like, it's true, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They consider their pets to be humans.
Absolutely.
And that is
Absolutely.
one example of how we anthropomorphize.
Absolutely. And I think the other criticism that sort of really resonated with me was that this is a Western idea. So is it a Western idea?
let's go to this example. So this is a mural painting from a text from 12th century by poet Jayadev, from his poetry, Geet Govindam, where you see that Yamuna river is not looked at as just a river, but in fact the river becomes a living entity and becomes a third character who starts affecting the relationship between the two characters Radha and Krishna. So the river in that text is not just looked at as a resource or a commodity or a hydrological flow, but goes beyond that. So therefore, to say that rivers have or water bodies have been part of the emotional cosmos of human beings for a very long time. And you see, this is an example of how this idea has been part of Indian culture and traditions for a very long time. So yeah, so to
Yeah, that's true. So I think that we've always thought of, you know, rivers as an example of a natural resource that's around us that's going to influence our lives. We've tried to look for human qualities in them, and actually, you see this in music as well. And one of the things that one finds in compositions of classical music is that the clouds are associated with human qualities, rivers, of course, etc. And so I think this is a way that we've been thinking about our natural wealth, our natural resources for a long time, and we've obviously been expressing it in the arts. Um,
would you like to sing a song for
I
us?
would very much like to sing a song for you. So this is something that I've composed. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, I'm a trained Hindustani classical vocalist, and the lyrical content of Hindustani classical compositions is fairly short. It's usually about 4 to 6 lines, which is called a bandish. And what the bandish does is talks about very specific things, because you only have a few lines. And one of the themes that one finds in classical music is often talking about nature. So talking about the spring season, for example, or talking about how beautiful a flower is, or something like that. And so I've been experimenting a little bit, Radhika, about looking at how we can use this medium to talk about conservation of our natural resources. And rivers are obviously something that are very much up for grabs because we've all seen the decay of rivers around us, which is really quite bizarre given how important they are in our survival, in our everyday life. And so this was an attempt as part of this project to compose a few lines on rivers. Interestingly, the raga that this was composed in is called Triveni, which literally means three, the confluence of three rivers, right? And the Triveni Sangam is supposed to be the three rivers that meet in Allahabad, the third being Saraswati, which is of course the mythical river, but which is why I chose this rag to talk about it. But yeah, so it sings about the importance of rivers in human life, in life in general. And so instead of just reading out the lyrics, maybe I'll just sing it for you. Yeah, okay, all right. So let me see if I can get this. So the lyrics are behet प्रवाह तेरो जो दिस में उत खेलत है खुशहाली. बेत प्रवाह तेरो, बेत प्रवाह तेरो, बेत प्रवाह तेरो जो उत खेलत है खुशहाली. बेत प्रवाह तेरो, बेत प्रवाह तेरो जो दिस में उत Krishna, Kaveri, Narmada, Tero hi jal se howe jeevan ko vistar vehet pravah tero. Tu tarangini amritvahini goda ganga Krishna Kaveri Narmada Tero hi jal se howe jeevan ko vistar behet pravah tero. So really, I think going back to the idea of how it all starts from water, right? I mean, rivers as the origin and perpetuators of life, and how we need to start thinking about them as perpetuators of life if we're going to conserve them, I think. Yeah.
At this point, I'll also like to ask you, apart from the lyrics of music, do you find there are other elements within the musical knowledge system which connect with the idea of water and nature, and how do you relate to that?
No, I mean, most certainly. I think the philosophy typically in Indian, what we call raga music, has been to constantly resonate with nature. I think one of the best examples of this is that we have ragas which are associated with times of the year, right? So, for example, the most famous example being Malhar, which is sort of sung, performed in the monsoons. Related so closely to the water cycle in the subcontinent, right? Because I think everybody realizes that this is what's giving life to the subcontinent, right? Without the monsoons, we don't have life on the subcontinent. I mean, to the point where, you know, there is a very popular composition in Rag Malhar, which actually is not about the rains, but is very obviously about the rains. So, you know, the lyrics are Kareem naam tero, tu saheb satar, dukh daridra dur karo, sukh devo saban ko, etc., etc., etc. And so nowhere in the composition is rain mentioned, nowhere in the composition is water mentioned. But given that it's in Malhar, it's obviously a prayer to the monsoons. The monsoons are the ones that are going to dispel poverty, famine. The monsoons are the ones that are going to, you know, bring life to the subcontinent. So I think, you know, there are so many such resonances that you find. It's interesting that you brought up the example of the Geet Govind, because you said that the river takes on a character. You see this also a lot in compositions, right? So they're actually attributed with human qualities. In fact, there's a very famous Thumri where the Naika, the narrator, says, Mora Saiya bulave adhi raat ko. So for some reason, her Saiya is calling her in the middle of the night. And so she says, Mora Saiya bulave adhi raat ko nadiya beri bhai. So she says the river is her berry, is her enemy, right? Because the river is standing in between her and her lover, who's calling out to her in the middle of the night. So so I think this kind of sense of attaching very human qualities to a river or the clouds, etc., is really quite prevalent, and I think it's such an integral part of the Indian artistic expression, right, that you can't really get away from it. There are also interesting metaphors that we use. So for example, you know, there's a very famous anecdote of Bade Ghulam Ali Khan Sahab standing on Marine Drive in Bombay and in the monsoons. And for anybody who's stood on Marine Drive in the monsoons in Bombay, you know, the experience of those waves coming in from the Arabian Sea and lashing against the rocks, I mean, it's an experience, right? And so the anecdote is that Bade Ghulam Ali Khan Sahab was sitting at Marine Drive, looking out into the ocean, and these waves were coming and lashing into the rocks, and he starts to sing, and his companion asks him, and so so his singing follows a cycle. He seems to start, it rises to a crescendo, and then he falls, and then he just keeps doing this over and over again. And he's singing tans that do this repeatedly. And his companion asks him, Khasa, what are you doing? So he says, no, I'm trying to time my tans with the waves that are coming, because unless they come like that, it's not real. It has to, the rhythm has to be off the flow of the ocean, right? And so this idea of flow, this idea of a steady movement, right, which we associate constantly with water bodies like river, it's considered an aesthetic that an artist must aspire to, an artist must, right? So for example, the word pravaha is used when describing the development of a raga. And if there is no pravaha in your raga, if there is no flow, if it's stagnant, it's not considered music of high caliber. So this metaphor exists, and so I think these resonances are inescapable, I think.
That's interesting because we also have this idea of pravaha or flow that you mentioned in dance. As a student of dance, you are asked to repeat the movements and the choreographies again and again, to the extent that till the moment you find a flow in it. And because the idea is that repetition of movements creates flow, and flow creates emotion. And therefore, connecting with the idea of how uh, connect how we are also looking at associating with rivers, because the basic nature of how rivers are formed is repeated movements, right? They cut through the rocks, they cut through the sediments through repeated movements, create their own flow, and that flow for us, we saying, should and in fact create emotions for us. So also connecting with this idea of flow over here, it also connects with the idea of the principle of sthanu, which you see in yoga practice, where it is believed that there is a principle of sthanu is the flow of energy from the bottom of the tree, from the roots to the leaves. And it is considered that although the tree is static, there is something happening within the tree where a yoga practitioner is also supposed to aspire to find that principle of sthanu within himself or herself when they practice different asanas. So how we are associating with this idea of flow and water bodies, and in fact then to go on to say that human body is also majorly a water, right? Composed of water. So therefore to say probably we are moving and dancing water bodies, no? So so connecting to this idea of flow and rivers, I also started looking at this idea of human body and flow a bit more deeply while I was doing my research projects on groundwater. I did my master's thesis on scientific evidence for artificial recharge mechanisms in the city of Bangalore specifically. And more recently, I did a study on natural springs, study of governance mechanisms of natural springs in India, where I came across this verse from the Karagalam, which is the 54th chapter in Brihat Samhita, where the verse says, groundwater, the hidden secret of nature, reveals itself through springs. It is like veins of blood flowing through the body. And this text again started making me think of how we are looking at human body, and also we're looking at groundwater and the rivers which flow on the surface of the earth. And how there's a metaphor of veins and blood flowing through them.
I think that's so effective because for groundwater specifically, which we never see, right? A metaphor like the blood flowing through your body really allows you to start thinking about how important it is, even though you don't see it, right? I mean, I think that's so effective. Yeah.
And from there, then coming to surface water, I would like to go into this in a bit detail, because I found when I found it, I was fascinated by it and would just love to share it. This is a story of flow of rivers, and it is coming from a study called The Heads and Tails of Ganga, where I worked with Professor Vijay Paranspe on it for 3 years. And this is a map by James Rennell from 1786. And if you look closely at it, you'll see that towards the end, Ganga and Brahmaputra are flowing into Bay of Bengal as two different rivers. And this map does not match with the present map of Brahmaputra river basin, because today you find them flowing together into the Bay of Bengal. And therefore, it made us question about where did this map come from? And it took us back. It took us back to Yamuna River, where we found that Yamuna River was earlier part of the Indus River basin. So Yamuna River used to flow towards the west into the Arabian Sea. There was tectonic plates, tectonic geological events, because of which Yamuna River shifted her course and started flowing towards the east and met Ganga at Allahabad, today we know as Prayagraj. And while this is happening in the heads of Ganga, we see in the tail end regions, Ganga River has also been shifting towards east. And over the past 300 or 250 years since, Ganga River used to initially flow through Hooghly River and flow into Bay of Bengal at the Ganga Sagar Island. But over a period of time, Ganga River has been shifting her course towards the east because of the tectonic plates, sedimentation, and tidal forces. And therefore, you see the shift of Ganga from here to slowly over here. And now we'll see there is GB, which is Ganga Brahmaputra. Now, to find that answer of how this could be possible, we came across this map, again by James Rennell, and then later, where you see Teesta River used to previously flow into Ganga. But there was a major earthquake and a major flood, because of which Teesta River shifted her course and came and joined Brahmaputra River, after which Ganga Brahmaputra merged, and then together with Meghna, they now flow into Bay of Bengal. And these changes in the flow patterns are called river avulsions in hydrological terms. And interestingly, these changes are still happening in the river basin as we speak of today. And the famous example is of the Kosi River basin. We all have heard about how Kosi River floods every year and is a cause of great sorrow to the people living in the Indian plains. And the fact is that Kosi River is actually named as Saptakoshi. There are 7 tributaries which join in Nepal and flow together into India, into the Indian plains. So because they flow through the Himalayas, they flow with a lot of velocity and therefore also carry a lot of sediment load with them. The moment they enter the Indian plains, the velocity of the river flow slows down, and therefore the sediment carrying capacity of the rivers also slow down. Therefore, they start depositing the sediment over a period of time, because of which next year when the river flows again, there are chances that she might change her channel and carve a new flow for herself, new channel. And this is why we see Kosi River floods every year. And although we have been trying to build embankments and dams, we have been unsuccessful because the amount of sediment that the river carries is humongous. Right? Would like to show this video where you see that Ganga is constantly shifting and changing the way she has been flowing. Right? It's very interesting, beautiful to notice that this also looks like the arteries and the veins in human bodies. Right? So while the rivers are flowing and changing their courses, this also makes us question and think about how are we then looking at the way we are relating with our rivers and water bodies. And going back to the first point of conversation where we spoke about how we are associating with rivers, and when we look at the way our basin management plans are today, we find them extremely fragmented, right? We are not looking at our rivers and water bodies with this perspective in mind. And therefore, we see that we also have a lot of issues associated with water bodies and river bodies. In fact, last year, with support of Living Waters Museum, and along with Sukrit Sen, who is a musician, and Aniket Kai, who's a theatre artist and filmmaker, we tried to create a dance production which tried to highlight one of the issues related to fragmented river basin approach, or fragmented nature in which we are looking at water bodies. And we see that the end result is always felt by the most marginalized sections of the community. And in order to speak about this, we came up with a production called Gagri Footy, wherein we tried to portray the journey of rural women who have to walk great distances in order to fetch a single pot of drinking water. And this dance production was inspired by Kabir's Doha, where he says, "Bhala hua muri gagri futi, main paniya bharan se chuti." So in Kabir's Doha, he has used the metaphor of a pot, gagri, in a very beautiful way where he relates human body with that of pot and therefore relates with the idea of death as bhala hua mari gagri futi mein panya bharan se chuti. In this, we have also used the metaphor of the pot as a human body, as well as taking it in literal sense of what the women must be going through on an everyday basis when they have to walk with this pot of water. So trying to understand and connect with the idea of looking at rivers, groundwater, the nature of governance mechanisms, and how that brings us to what is actually happening to human beings today and how we are responding, and therefore bridging the idea of water and dance together is.
So what was the response like to this project?
So this production was performed in three sites. One was the Sasundogs Festival, and one was Pondicherry Water Festival, and the other one was recently this year at Netherlands. Interestingly, at the Pondicherry Water Festival, we had one of the government officials who had come in for the festival. This lady came up to me later and said that she had never thought of this aspect that women have to walk for water, and that now that she's part of the government mechanism and water department, she'll make sure that she brings this idea to the forefront and does something about it. So I think that was a very satisfying experience to see that this just does not just remain as an artistic endeavor, but goes on and translates further into action.
So performance as education, perhaps.
Probably.
But it's of course not just in rural settings that river health is decaying. I think urban rivers are in great crisis. Nobody in Pune needs to be told this. If you've just walked along the Muramutha, you know that the river is in a lot of crisis. And I just want to talk about a science project that we're running in the lab at the moment, and it's in early stages, but we're already starting to see some really scary trends. So we think about conservation of rivers from the point of view of plastics, we think about it from the point of view of fish getting poisoned, etc. But urban rivers are flooded with so much stuff, sewage, industrial waste, you name it, it's there in urban rivers. And so we've initiated a project recently trying to look at the bacterial load in these rivers, and we're sampling from various places within Pune city. And we find an absurdly large fraction of bacteria that we isolate are what are called coliforms, things like E. coli, which normally live in the human gut. They're not normally found in rivers. So what this means is that it's all coming from sewage, which is basically flowing through our city. Not only that, something that we're interested in, which is drug resistance, so antibiotic resistance. And, we find absurdly high frequencies of what is called mobilizable resistance, which means resistance that can just simply spread from one bacterium to the other if they're allowed to be together for long enough. And the rates of mobilizable resistance that we find in the Muramutha ought to have raised alarm many years ago. But I think one of the problems, of course, is lack of rigorous data. Also a receptive agency that will look at this data, see what the sources are, etc. And really it boils down to this idea of one health, which is the idea that human health can't really be dissociated from the health of the environment that humans live in, right? And so the health of the city can't really be dissociated from the health of the river, right? Because all of this is going to end up in the fish that we eat. It's going to end up in the soil that we use to do our gardening. It's going to end up in the water that we drink, perhaps. And maybe, worse off, maybe it's going to end up in the water that somebody else downstream of Pune drinks, which perhaps is worse because we're the ones generating all the waste. So I think we see this in urban rivers as well. There is a crisis, and I think that if I can compose a composition on this to perhaps more effectively deliver this message instead of the graph that's currently on the slide, maybe it reaches more people. But I mean, coming back to the idea of delivering these kinds of messages through performance. I mean, you yourself anecdotally experienced this. So what's the power, you think, in performance as a medium to talk about these issues?
this point, I would like to speak about these two books, which have helped me to understand and answer this question for myself better. And because uh, every time this idea of arts and water and environment would come up, people would end up saying, okay, we can use arts for social awareness, right? We can use arts for communication. But in my head, I was thinking there's more to arts than that. It's more than just a tool to communicate. And why is this why was the question. So there's this very interesting book called Word Sound Image by Saskia Kirstenboom, where she speaks about how every word creates a sound, and every sound therefore creates an image in our minds. And therefore, for centuries within Indian cultures, oral traditions were very often performed as well. They were not just narrated or they were not just written down, but they were also performed. And therefore, going to the idea of how we are looking at the question which I started off with, of why Ganga being angry doesn't make sense in a written text, but Ganga being angry makes sense when you perform it. Probably there is that difference that is happening in the mediums or the forms in which we are delivering them, because she very beautifully illustrates through a diagram in her book where she speaks about how a written text often gets removed from its context and becomes a static representation. Whereas performing arts, because it is constantly being performed with different audiences in different settings, there is a constant way of relating and associating with in different ways, because the context keeps changing, the meaning keeps changing, and therefore its relevance also keeps changing. And therefore this strength that the performing arts has is something that we really need to touch upon, and which later very beautifully is also elaborated by Susan Langer in her book Feeling and Form, where she speaks about how art forms, we often hear this term, no, art is the mirror of society. And I think she goes on further to explain that that's not the case. And I think I believe in that, because art forms or movies for that matter, they're not just mirroring the society. She speaks about how they are symbolic representations. And because they are symbolic representations, they are able to encode many layers of understanding of human experience and feelings, which a written text sometimes fails to encode. And therefore it's not just a direct mirror, but rather a symbolic representation of what is happening in human understanding and feeling. And therefore, because we see these things happening in performing arts, and I'm also still trying to understand what they are saying and what is happening, I think that is where we are trying to connect on these lines between art forms and
So I think also going back maybe to what you said earlier about repetition creating flow, which is really possible in performance because the performance starts and it ends. And if you want to revisit it, it has to be performed again, right? And every time you perform it, you're going to respond differently to who's sitting in front of you, what you've been through from the first performance to the next. Whereas the written word is relatively more static in that sense, right?
Right. The meaning could change based on the reader, but the context in which it was written and how it was framed remains the same. So there's a difference, therefore, is something that I'm also trying to question and understand deeper. Yeah.
So I think we've said a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up our conversation with another performance, videographed performance of Radhika's. I really tried very hard to get her to perform today, but she's on a performance sabbatical, so we will respect that and we will see a video of her performing.
I'd just like to say it's not a performance, it's an experiment which we tried.
Performance is experiment.
दर्द बिन लाज भी भर दिया इनवर्स की शुरुआत कहाँ से हुई, तो या नाद या तुम्हारा नृत्य से हुई.
People who listen to this kind of or like experience this kind of art form will have more opportunity to make changes.
I like the idea of the health of the river connecting with the health of the people.
To sort of show the issues in the society. Like
I saw the title of the presentation today's conversation. I dragged myself actually.